Pacing is the most important skill any GM needs to have. It's what will separate your players from making excuses to miss the next session versus showing up excited every single week for your game.
But wait, I didn't drop $30,000 for an English degree. What's pacing?
Now, the most basic Wikipedia-ass definition is that pace is the speed at which a story is told. It's why The Lord of the Rings feels like it's 22 minutes and why an episode of Naruto feels like it's 220 minutes.
How do I actually use this for my sessions?
Great question. First, we need to identify what makes something intense in an RPG session versus what makes something more dull. Obviously, combat, when done right, is a high-intensity event. Good RPG combat will have your players on the edge of their seats waiting to find out what happens next. Bad RPG combat is gonna do the opposite. How do you run good RPG combat? Play Dungeon World. Or just watch one of the 50 gazillion tutorials people have already made on YouTube. High-stakes negotiations can also crank the intensity of a session up to 11, but the key word here is high stakes. Bartering with a shopkeep over letting the party take all of his potions for free tends to be a little bit less intense than the party pleading with the local lord or lady for their lives. Granted, your results may vary. Low intensity events tend to be like lore dumps, shopping, carousing, you get the idea. Here's a graph of how I like to structure my sessions. And I've been told by a whole 3 people that I am a master at pacing. Now, for those of you half paying attention, the x-axis is the length of time of the session, whereas the y-axis is the intensity. Now, you might notice we aren't starting this session with a super high intensity event. This is because I've actually GM'd an RPG before, and I know it takes your players a couple minutes to, get into things and get into game mode. Now, ideally, you'll want this phase to be as short as possible, but at the same time, don't poo-poo your players' fun and just jump right into the session. That's called being a dickhead. Once everyone's comfortable and ready to play some MFD&D, PF, DW, or whatever, that's when we move into phase 2. This is where you bust out the set piece. The big one. The wyvern attacking the caribou. The reveal that an ancient white dragon is hiding out underneath the city with a ticking time bomb. Typically, this is the easiest thing to prep, as most likely nothing of significance has really happened during phase 1. Unless, of course, it did. In the most recent session of my Dungeon World campaign with the Rules Lawyer and friends, click right here to check that out, I had a giant battle with an apocalypse dragon besieging the town that they're in, prepped and ready to go. But then Jonah the Ranger, played by my friend Raul, decided to go explore the wilderness while the rest of the party participated in downtime. To keep things interesting, and because I didn't actually prep for this, I had Raul roll random encounters for every single day that Jonah was out exploring. Now, in case you couldn't figure it out, this is very low on the intensity scale, and I could tell that the players were starting to get a little bored. I was ready to skip ahead and give Raul some basic info on the surrounding wilderness when he rolled a 1. Now, what I'm about to say will completely ruin the magic for anyone who's ever played in one of my games. I make up random encounter tables on the spot. Come to think of it, I make up a lot of stuff on the spot. Now, in this situation, I knew that Jonah was in an arid savanna biome that's patrolled by dragons, being raided by centaurs, and being invaded by orcs. And I knew the intensity and the player interest was declining rapidly. So I threw a dragon at it. Now, is throwing a dragon at a level 2 PC necessarily a good idea? Who cares? This is Dungeon World. I did it anyway. Naturally, this ramped up the tension in the session as Jonah was now fighting for his life while the rest of the party was gallivanting around town.
Aren't you supposed to never split the party? Isn't that bad DMing?
Now, splitting the party is a whole nother subject that's been done a million times. But the way to keep your sessions pacing up when the party is split is to constantly be bouncing between all of the players. And honestly, this is something that you should be doing even when the party isn't split. Nothing kills a session for your players than when one player gets the spotlight for 20 minutes and everyone else is just kind of there.
Hold up. How are you supposed to pull this off?
Through the magic of social skills. Slightly kidding. If you don't have the natural ability to read people, win friends, and influence people, it doesn't mean you're doomed. You just have to get a little bit more mechanical with how you bounce the spotlight. A good rule of thumb is to focus on each player for about 5 minutes. Now, don't be a robot.
If you set a 5-minute timer behind the DM screen and it goes off in the middle of a player describing an action that they're doing, or like if there's a scene going on, don't immediately just say shut up and then bounce to the next player. But if it does leave them off on a little cliffhanger because they don't know what's going to happen next, that's really good for keeping their interest up.
Okay, so you've wrapped up throwing your party's ranger up against insurmountable odds, or whatever more fair thing you've prepped for your players. What do you do now? We move on to phase 3. In traditional storytelling, after a big climactic scene like a giant battle or a confrontation, standoff, betrayal, you get the idea, we have a little bit of falling action. And it's no different here. We want to give our players the chance to breathe and for the consequences of the actions that just happen to start to take hold. Definitely kind of go with the vibe of the session and roll with the punches of what the players are providing. But if you kind of get stalled, this is where you can bring in some prepped low intensity events. Maybe you can have them overhear some rumors or some local townspeople congratulate them on the thing they just accomplished. Or maybe you can even hit them with a lore dump. Just kidding. Never lore dump. But the moral of the story is it's kind of hard to go wrong here, except in the one way that it is absolutely possible to go wrong here. After hitting your players with something intense, you don't want to immediately go and follow that up with another intense scene. First off, when everything is heavy, then nothing is. Big epic scenes stick with us because they're surrounded by the more mundane. And that's not to say the mundane is even bad. Some of my favorite moments in RPGs that I've run, and in life for that matter, have come from totally ordinary things. And when you throw massive moment after massive moment at your players, they stop feeling like massive moments and they start just feeling like moments. The second reason is that people get tired. Homeric combat, startling reveals, and grandiloquent trials take a lot of energy out of both you as the GM and your players. If you keep bombarding them with high energy scenes, they're gonna lose focus fast because you haven't given them an opportunity to recharge.
So you might be thinking you're out of the woods now. It's time to wrap the session up and say, see you next week to everyone, right? Wrong. If you end your session on a low intensity note like this, you don't really leave your players with anything to look forward to next week. Furthermore, in case you did spend $30,000 on an English degree, you might have noticed that we didn't have any rising action in our session. Now, in case you didn't pay attention in high school English class, the rising action is pretty much everything that happens between the introduction and the climax in a story. It's what builds all that juicy tension that gets released in the big epic finale. Now, in practical terms, that means that after your players have had a minute to collect themselves and relax after a big epic fight scene, you want to start building up the next big epic fight scene. This is when the villains and other forces at work in your world start setting the next phases of their plans in motion. The mad jester starts murdering innocent townfolk until the paladin reveals their true identity. Or maybe the monk's evil second personality that only comes out when they long rest starts recruiting cult members. In a perfect world, you'll spend the rest of the session building this tension up, keeping your players at the edge of their seats wanting to know what's gonna happen next. And then you end the session. You don't have to be William Shakespeare to realize that ending the session when you build up to a breaking point is gonna keep your players wanting more. And if you're lucky, they'll be talking about it all week.